Hello and welcome to the first week 10 feedback video, in which I'm going to talk about the discussion questions from the chapter about revivalism, reform and artistic renaissance. The first question was, how and why did the movement against slavery become more radical? We see a shift in this era from gradualism, the idea that slavery would be got rid of by individual slaves being freed or by colonization of Liberia in West Africa, to the idea that slavery had to be abolished and had to be abolished immediately because it was a moral evil that could not be permitted to exist any longer. A few reasons for this. One was slavery was becoming, if anything, stronger, leading to a greater backlash against it. The industrialization of the cotton process and the industrialization of manufacture of cotton goods helped to revive the southern slave-based economy around the crop of cotton. There was also a sense that the Southerners were digging in their heels. For example, manumission, the voluntary freeing of slaves, was made actually harder by laws in most of the Southern states. And the sense of moral imperative that slavery was an evil that could not be tolerated reflects the impact of the Second Great Awakening, that great religious movement that inspired not just religious engagement, but often engagement with social issues. You often see a very strong correlation between areas, for example, Ohio and upstate New York, where anti-slavery and feminist agitation was strongest, and areas that the Second Great Awakening had been at its strongest. Also, a lot of you pointed to the fact that the market revolution had created greater communication opportunities. The message of anti-slavery could be communicated, for example, in mass mailing campaigns of sending abolitionist literature to southern states, and also in incidents such as that of Box Brown, who had himself mailed from the South to an anti-slavery organization in the North. The second question was, what led to the emergence of a movement for women's rights? The feminist movement, what is sometimes called first wave feminism, emerged out of the anti-slavery movement. Women abolitionist campaigners were often frustrated at their treatment by men within the movement, for example, not being allowed to speak or having to sit separately from men in the audience, and began to add their own demand for women's rights to the demand for rights for the slaves. And women in the Jacksonian era had also been prominent in the movement against the removal of the Native American tribes. This was a contradictory era for women. Attitudes were emphasizing women's domestic role, the so-called cult of domesticity or cult of true womanhood, that said the woman should be at home raising the children. But also as a time of women being in the workplace. For example, last week we saw the Lowell Mill Girls. So women being pulled between greater opportunities and greater repression back into a domestic environment. But even the cult of domesticity emphasized that women were the moral force within their family. And some women took that idea of women as a moral force and applied it to political change. They were the moral force, for example, for the abolition of slavery. The third question asked, what developments in the 19th century society were the transcendentalists reacting against? Well, broadly speaking, they were reacting against industrialization and the market revolution. They felt industrialization was dehumanizing. They felt it was taking people away from God and away from the spiritual life to focus more on the material. Classic example of a transcendentalist writer is Henry David Thoreau. He rejected industrialization. For example, he wrote against the railroad, arguing that it was merely a more expensive means to the same end that could be achieved without the need for industrialization. And he went off to live in the woods at Walden Pond. The idea of Walden Pond as being in the wilderness is, shall we say, very exaggerated by Thoreau. It was on his mother's property, and he could always wander into town or have his mother deliver goods to him whenever he wanted. But Thoreau presents Walden as being this turn towards a simple life of nature and a rejection of the modern life of commercialization and industrialization.